İyi akşamlar, good evening. We are very honored to have Mr. Schroeder with us. Schroeder, sorry. And of course, Dr. Fuhrmann, who will give us, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bu bizim Arkas Sanat Bornova'ya hoş geldiniz. We are very pleased to have you in this Arkas Art Center, Bornova. It's an old house of 700s, and we have repaired it, restored it, made it better than it was ever been. So we appreciate the fact that you do such events here. It gives prestige to the house. Your availability here is a plus for us. So we thank you very much. I don't want to take more of your time because Dr. Fuhrmann has to talk and we have a schedule. That's why. Dr. Fuhrmann, thank you. Please.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes, sorry. My protocol is not my
We are amongst ourselves, so that's Dear guest, Mr. Arkas, Dr. Fuhrmann, I have the pleasure to welcome you to a new lecture on the topic of İZMİR Port Society. As last week's evening with Philip Mansell, which was well organized by the Levantine Association, tonight it's on us as the Consulate of Germany in İzmir to be the host, although you are the host, but we are organizing or co-organizing the meeting. Speaker today will be Dr. Malte Fuhrmann, an esteemed historian of the Mediterranean, Turkey and Southeast European history, and author of a book on, and I quote, port cities of the Mediterranean, urban culture in the late Ottoman Empire, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Very prestigious. We're very grateful to you, Mr. Arkas, and the Arkas Art Center for hosting us tonight in this beautiful premises. Matthäus Köşkü in Bornova, 19th century mention of İzmir's trader family, I have been told. Very convenient location for the lecture tonight. And please stay for a vin d'honneur after the lecture and after the discussion we'll have afterwards. Tonight's lecture forms part of a series of lectures on İzmir as a port city in the Eastern Mediterranean. Series is being organized by a group of institutions in İzmir, and that's why it was so important for me to have this pull-up, because that shows you who else is organizing these events with us. We're looking forward to the events in the future to come. As you know, port cities today, as in history, all seem to have one thing in common, that's diversity. And this is especially true for Mediterranean port cities. And despite long centuries of conflict and strife, Mediterranean, and as you know, literally Mediterranean means the sea between the lands. It's always been a place of diversity, of waters that connect rather than divide, of shipping routes bringing together peoples from adjacent shores. And the Eastern Mediterranean in particular was one of the cradles of civilization, as everybody knows. Today we then tend to think sometimes a bit nostalgically of the Belle Epoque around 1900, an ideal world of international social and trading relations, where Mediterranean port cities like İzmir were bustling with activity through their international networks. That was a good old time. But history, of course, has many perspectives, and it is often written by the winners, all those who survive. And even a booming city like İzmir and Smyrna around 1900 was probably not an ideal place for everybody. As Europeans, we tend to forget that decades of buoyant global exchange before World War I was also the days of European global domination. So everything has two sides. The important part of humanity then, it wasn't exactly a Belle Epoque, but by and large an area of strife and colonialism. But I stop here because it's not me who's giving the lecture, and I will give the floor to Dr. Fuhrmann, and I'm sure you will give us new perspectives on what it means to be a port city like İzmir, what it means or could mean for us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. Let's see. I hope everybody can hear me and the sound is all right, like it is. Thank you, Mr. Arkas. Thank you, Mr. Schröer. Thank you for everybody from Arkas House and from the Consulate General who made this possible and who invited me to İzmir, one of the places which definitely has inspired me to work for many years on the history of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 19th century. Just so you can have an impression yourself, I might hand around the book for you to have a look at. I've already been told that it is a bit of an affront to come to İzmir and start with a slide showing Istanbul instead. I apologize for that. I simply put it there because the publishing house, under many pictures I gave them from İzmir and Istanbul, chose this Istanbul picture because it's a nice picture, I think, more than because they favored the city. So let's move on instead to this city, which I think most people here will recognize in the late 19th century, the cordon, the quays as they looked back then. I dare say we have, in the last 20 to 30 years, actually learned a lot about urban life in the 19th century in the port cities of the Mediterranean. And in the Ottoman port cities especially. There have been a number of great studies, and I think some people in the room here actually have contributed to that. But unfortunately, I think until today there isn't much, not much of this has gone beyond our limited realm of specialists who study this. Who study this professionally as historians. As a whole, this diversity, which Herr Schröer has already talked about, of the port cities, is very much understood as a zero-sum game. You're a Turk, or you're a Greek, or you're a Sephard. You have to be one of the above. That actually our life in these cities in the 19th century was much more complex is something we have to still bring across to a wider awareness, I believe. And this can best be shown actually by referring to these port cities. And yeah, let's just start with a photograph. So we have here a scene, could have been in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, can't quite say for sure, but we see some male pedestrians walking up and down the waterfront. We see two men from the back here. They wear fezzes with kerchief wrapped around it. One of them wears a long frock coat, the other one wears baggy pants or shalvar and some belts with jingly coins around his waist. And coming towards them is this man with a bowler hat who looks like he's about to bump into them. If we just would take this little corner, we might say this is the clash of civilizations. Western dress here, Eastern dress there. But if we look a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, we get a larger picture. We see, for example, this man who is wearing a fez, but at the same time a wide coat, not quite as wide as the person we see from the back. He has his beard trimmed at, you might say, half length. He has a walking cane. And here on the far right, we see yet another person wearing a fez, but with a very shortly trimmed beard and very tight tailored vests and white suit. So this idea of clash doesn't really work out. There are different degrees to which people adopted Western dress and to which degrees they stuck with traditional dress. There are many shades in between. You try to adopt it to yourself, your own position, your own way of expressing yourself is what you can learn from this picture. What about this picture? Now we're moving on to Salonika, the practically sister city of İzmir on the far side of the water. And we see a picture from 1913. The city has just been annexed by Greece. Sorry, no, the picture is 1915. The city has been annexed by Greece. We have British and French soldiers in town. But going to the cinema at the time, we find actually fairly few soldiers in the crowd. Those two people in front of the door, if you can recognize them, they're very small. Instead, you find people wearing fezzes, wearing flat caps. You find especially a lot of women and a lot of girls wearing bonnets. Maybe it's a school excursion or girls coming after school to the cinema. And when you look at what they come to see, you actually see that on the one hand, they might be coming for Hearts of the West, an American film, or for L'Homme qui assassina, which is a French film, but playing in Istanbul, which is why when you look very closely, you'll see that some of the figures on the posters actually wear fezzes. And for neither of these films do you see any Greek subtitles. So you go to this film apparently and you're expected to know enough French to make sense of L'Homme qui assassina. And we can also learn that even after the annexation by Greece, people are still interested in stories situated in Istanbul and not just in a purely Greek context. Returning to Istanbul, a few years earlier, this is 1913, sorry, we see here Galata, the building in the middle you might still recognize as it's still standing. But what you can see in this time period, what you can't see anymore today, is that it was built by the Wiener Bankenverein, the Vienna Bank Association, as an example of Art Nouveau, a very new style at the time. This was not something which came much later to the East, but something where we can see from the beginning the city of Istanbul and the Istanbulites engaged with these new forms. Same thing goes for the no longer existing mosque by the side. That is also an you might say an experiment in modern styles. And another thing, when you look around, you see a pure cacophony of different languages for the signs of advertisement. Möble chez Psalti, furniture from Psalti. That's what you can read in French, but right next to it you have Tiring written in Arabic, Armenian and Cyrillic letters. Somewhere on the far left, hard to read, you see Stein, another department store, just like Tiring. So, plus if you look at the crowd, you'll see a similar mix of costumes, just as on the İzmir shores. So, these cities were much more diverse, much more mixed than a standard idea of a Greek city or a Turkish city or a Muslim city would make them look. Nonetheless, we would not usually put these photos in a Turkish history school book or in a Greek history school book, which instead it's become this sort of niche history topic. Urban history, cultural history of the 19th century. Why is that? Why does it seem something so alien to see these mixed crowds, to see people queuing at a French language cinema in Salonika before the 20th century? And some degree, I think this person on the picture here, Max Weber, is to blame. Together with our ideas of modernity, of how modernization goes about. At the beginning of the 20th century, this idea arose that part of this is that the European city is somehow one of the reasons why capitalism, participative democracy, and these other institutions evolved. And according to Weber, this is something strictly Western. And because of that, to study an Asian city is to some degree boring. You don't expect to find a subject there, something worth studying. Because in this idea, you have just the despotic ruler, the Sultan, and his subjects. And these are imagined to be mainly somewhere located in an agricultural emporium. And Marxist theory didn't do much to challenge this, just sort of repeated this idea. But then, if we look at cities of the 19th century around the Mediterranean, what is the first city to become a city with more than 1 million inhabitants? It's Istanbul. It's not Marseille. It's not Barcelona. It's not any of these other cities which are taken as these prime examples of modernity. Istanbul was the largest city in the early modern period and is the first to become a city of more than 1 million inhabitants. And even if we go looking around the other large cities of the period, we will still find Alexandria and İzmir around 1900 among the 10 largest cities of the period. It's not because of their heavy industry. Usually you tend to think from this classic modernization theory, okay, an important city must have heavy industry. None of these cities have heavy industry. There's light industry and there's a booming import-export business, but that's enough to propel these cities among the top 10 cities in size among the 19th century Mediterranean ports. So that is why I felt that it was worthwhile to deal in more detail with these cities in particular and with the urban culture of the period. I focused on the 3 examples I showed you, Salonika, Istanbul, İzmir, and on certain aspects I'll try to briefly run through them. On the one hand, there's the aspect of space, spatial relations of power, which change dramatically in the 19th century, of course. There is the topic of entertainment, which I find is something which needs more looking at, and the question of identities, before then coming to the part of how the particular version of modernity of these Mediterranean cities came to an end. Okay, to start with space. So if we remember 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte lands in Egypt, takes over with relative ease the Ottoman province of Egypt. On the other hand, if we look at the northern end of the Ottoman Empire, Russia has already invaded large parts of the Black Sea area by this time, by the late 18th century. So while this does not end the Ottoman Empire overnight, it ends sort of Ottoman hegemony over the Eastern Mediterranean. It's clear if one of these armies starts marching, the Ottoman Empire by itself will not have much to offer as far as resistance goes. But that doesn't sort of fill this power gap. The Ottoman Empire is still there. It's not a military might, but none of these states, Russia, France, Great Britain, apart from some provinces around the Mediterranean, they cannot just walk in and take over the place. So what happens? What fills this power gap? And that's where I would say it is the European dream. What is the European dream? So if we look at a number of statements by several politicians of the time, by intellectuals, writers, they quite often express that this period, the 19th century, this great period of change with new technologies arising, new forms of participation, it is actually a period where different people can join in, can participate, can find their place in the modern world. Maybe not everybody, but the idea is that it's an open question. Who will 100 years later still be a powerful state, or actually be among the people who count around the world? It's not clear that from the beginning that it will all be just nivellated in some great imperialist endeavor. There are some French intellectuals, Saint-Simonists, who speak of the Mediterranean as a wedding bed between East and West, that this will be the way the civilizations on both sides find together through the stronger interaction which you have because of the steam-powered ships which come to dominate the Mediterranean, both in military and in trade and in passenger transport. And what this could mean for the Ottoman Empire, we find spelled out by the British ambassador, Stratford Canning, here in this town as he lays the founding stone for Alsancak train station, or La Punta train station as it was called contemporaneously. And that is the idea: European interests, Turkish interests don't have to be a clash. They could consolidate, they could come together, and then other things such as good governance, an end to war could sort of trickle down, as you can see from the statement. Hyde Clark, who was heading the railway down to Aydın at the time it was being constructed, spells this out in a little bit more detail. Of course, the idea is that there will be a strong economic interaction, a dependency that is rather obvious from his statement, but that this would work to the benefit of both sides. And as we can see, this is Clark speaking at the inauguration of Ayasuluk, what is now Selçuk train station. The governor at the time, Mehmet Reşit Pasha, he echoes this. This is not something people thought is a one-sided imperialist imposition. No, people thought that by jumping on the bandwagon of this drive to modernity, people in the Ottoman Empire could find their place in the world. And the other thing, it is also not just a top-down thing. Too often we've just looked at the Tanzimat bureaucrats and their endeavors, their attitudes towards this wave of changing things. It's also bottom-up. Leon Sciacchi, he's the son of a leading merchant in Salonika at the turn towards the 20th century. He's all for it. He explains this in this quote. He explains this feeling that people in Salonika, they wanted out. They didn't want to just always have to deal with their community, their own parish, or their own consul, or their own religious authorities. There was an interest in pushing towards some kind of interaction with the wider world. How does this change the cities I'm talking about? It impacts on the urban space. And it starts, and I'd say that's perhaps the most significant thing. It starts with the cordon, with the case of İzmir. What you would see at the middle of the 19th century is actually a bit of a ramshackle picture. Every trader would have their warehouse, as you can see, nothing very pretty towards the water side, just something to stack their goods for selling and for importing and exporting. And just beyond that, you would see Frank Street, the more elegant houses in the second row, and then beyond the large Greek churches of town. So this was something foreigners would complain about, this first impression you would get when sailing into Smyrna or İzmir, that you would sort of see a backyard, a warehouse, nothing much pleasing for the eye. But at the same time, the locals themselves were also driving for some kind of public space, to no longer have these restrictions you have on the water side, to have something elegant, to have something which is pleasing to the eye. And that's how, long story short, the Smyrna quays came about. These very regularized, proper extensions into the water side. It was a huge endeavor at the time. I'm kind of skipping over the technical and local problems that arose. But it now conformed sort of to this image of a Mediterranean port, which people wanted to see, both as people of the city and people arriving. And this new public space, which was created not so much by commerce, actually. A lot of the traders were very much against it. The old way of doing things was more convenient, was cheaper. Initially, not many people wanted actually better facilities and more controlled facilities for the port. But the citizens very quickly appropriated the space as something, a site of recreation, of leisure, of course also of changed work patterns. I'm going to just skim past that. The Volta or the Corso evolved, a name borrowed obviously from Italian. People would, in the evenings towards sunset, walk up and down this space. You could either follow the boats in the bay, their movements. You could bump into your friends, neighbors, perhaps new acquaintances. You could stop, have a beer somewhere, buy an ice cream, or end up actually going out in the various night clubs or places. So this pretty much conformed to expectations, was in the vein of what people would call westernization, but there were also some things which displeased a lot of the observers. On the one hand, there was a row about what kind of dress you should wear. Should you actually be forced to wear suit and tie when going out, or should you be able to go out in a pajama style clothing, something more comfortable, but something which appears less Western? And on the other hand, some of the activities going on were also either considered strange or not Western enough, or unpleasing. For example, on the one hand, this was a place for music to be played. The famous Smirneka, or later known as Rembetiko music, that would happen, together with waltz music, which could be played by bands coming from Bohemia or the east of the Habsburg Empire. Eventually this music actually mixed too. There were kind of crossovers between the different styles. What was considered yet more strange, clam diving. So on these quay walls you would have clams growing, and so it could be a thing for people to dive in, gather clams from those walls and come back up. Or some people just went swimming for pleasure. But of course, these people would go in naked or semi-naked and then stand among these crowds in suit and tie or in best Sunday dresses. This was another form of where this idea of what to do and how to conform to a Western image was not just an act of adaptation of Western standards, but of appropriation, of changing things to fit to what people wanted at the time. Which brings us to the topic of entertainment in general. Entertainment was, for many, perhaps a shortcut to the European dream. To actually create a situation where Ottoman politics, Ottoman economics, the Ottoman military would conform to a European standard. That was obviously always going to be a long, long road. But if you went for a night in the theater, if you went for a night to the ball, you could for a moment imagine that you were part of a wider world, that you were considered equal, that you were not some corner of the Eastern Mediterranean people in London or Paris or Berlin might be looking down on. One important aspect was, of course, the balls. This was a huge social event in this period. If you just skim through some newspapers from this time, from Salonika, İzmir, or Istanbul, you will see countless announcements. This family is doing their annual ball, or that family, they are inviting, they are going to, and this went on basically from January until April, because this was tied to the also to the carnival period, to the period before fasting, before the fasting before Easter. So for months, people would have to take part, people would have to be hosts. There were countless obligations, and you had to be very careful. You could not just favor one group. There would be one ball perhaps for the high society of town, where you had to equally have all communities represented. You have to have another invitation more for your own community, maybe for the Germans of town. And in that way, it seems a great preoccupation, and these things were not just formal little occasions. You find in a lot of the newspapers that dancing went on until 3 or 5 in the morning, and people continued to do conversation until 7 in the morning. So it was a time when people lived lived this form of exchange through entertainment between different parts of local society. The other thing which becomes practically an obsession is theater, and especially opera. This goes very much in tune with the general tastes of the 19th century around the continent, perhaps around the world. Opera is the form of large popular entertainment in this period. And once again, we find İzmir pretty much at the forefront. Sorry for once again showing an Istanbul theater first, but that's just because I don't have pictures of the early İzmir theaters. Opera is something which develops, especially in Italy, in the 17th century. And from the very beginning, there are attempts to copy this on Ottoman ground. And the thing we can trace in literature is that just some local Franks produce their own opera. They enact things as amateur groups as early as the mid-17th century. But when do real theaters start operating on? This is basically through the initiative of Italian opera artists. They're used to going on tour around the Mediterranean. Already before the steamship, but more in force once the steamship is around. And very soon they find, well, there's no proper stages for this. They can operate in a salon, but how much money can you make if you only have a crowd which fits into one salon, and still you need to do all kinds, you need some space for the stage. So it begins by Italian artists building their own improvised wooden stages somewhere around town. That's how the Naum Theater is created. It's the villa which used to be there burns down in central Pera, in central Beyoğlu, Istanbul. The Naum family rents it out. These improvised wooden stages come, and then, only then, in 1841, the actual Naum Theater is constructed on the same grounds by an Italian impresario. İzmir is a few weeks ahead of Istanbul in opening its first dedicated theater. The Efterpe Theater in 1841 opens here. By 1862 we find also something called the Italian Melodrama Theater, and more importantly the Camerano Theater. So once again named after the Italian impresario who takes the initiative to construct the building. It is claimed to be the second largest theater at the time around the Eastern Mediterranean, second only to Cairo. It continues to exist until 1884, when it burns down, which is quite often the end of these kind of theaters. The Naum Theater also already in 1870 burns down. And then there's quite a long gap where there's no dedicated theater either in Istanbul or in İzmir. When people stage their performances in so-called café chantant, cafes which have their own stage, which improvise, one day have acrobats, then just have some background music while you're enjoying your dinner, until the Petit Champ Winter Theater comes. Some of you might know Petit Champ is today more commonly known as Tepebaşı. So this building you see here used to be the theater in the place where now this large TRT radio and television building is located on Tepebaşı in Istanbul. What happens to İzmir? There's also this long hiatus between the Camerano Theater and then the so-called opera or the Smyrna Theater. It's opens its doors in 1894, here a picture from 1911. It is a municipal initiative funded through a loan from several families in the city to actually create a large and representative building, as you can see right next to the French consulate on the cordon. The other aspect of entertainment I'd like to briefly touch upon, but won't have much time to talk about, is beer. If you think of it, beer by now is of course the #1 alcoholic drink in Turkey. I think there's no question. Rakı has been bypassed long ago. But when did this happen? When did people actually start drinking beer? That's an open question, because when you look at the period around the 1830s, you will see that beer is still very much frowned upon by locals. It's there, but usually just a few expats drink it, and then it becomes all of a sudden quite popular, and by the 1890s you have large industrial breweries. You have Bomonti in Istanbul, you have the Olympos brewery in Salonika. Once again, İzmir a little bit faster than the others. Some of you might know of the Prokop brewery. It starts operating already, for this I actually have to check my notes. 1845 apparently. The drawback, it's not industrial. It's not powered by steam, so it produces much smaller quantities, is much more local beer than Bomonti, which you can buy across the Ottoman Empire, which is a huge success story. But nonetheless, from this sort of fringe status of beer, which starts to disappear here earlier than elsewhere, beer finds its place in the center of society. Why did people go to drink beer? Why did they not stick to a classic meyhane but prefer these beer gardens? On the one hand, just to try to sum it up quickly, on the one hand, beer gardens were mixed sex places to go out. The meyhane classically was a men's abode. You would not go there as a family, but the beer gardens, at least some of them, you could. It was a sign also that you were open to the new, to changes, to different tastes, that you didn't insist on just drinking the drinks which were traditional. And that's part of the success story of the drink. But I wanted to also get to the topic of identities, and for that I have to switch now briefly. I have to leave the PowerPoint and have to switch to the music I have here, so just a second. Oops. I'll get to the lyrics in a second. Okay, sorry, back to the PowerPoint. And oops, it went actually straight back to the slide I wanted to show you. Okay, so here is in Latin letters what you just had to hear. This song, an old Greek song from İzmir, it's actually a situation between a man and a woman. The guy passes a woman in the street and makes a sort of pass at her, says like, oh, are you a Turk or a Rum? Or are you actually an English woman or a French woman? You are so beautiful. And she replies, well, what does it concern you whether I'm from Menemen or Cordelio, Karşıyaka? And what do you care about how I wear my shalvar, whether it's black or what? What is this song about? Why do I play it here in this context? I think it is a sign of ambiguity of identity and celebrating actually the ambiguity of identity. Probably the way 19th century women dressed in this town, this person could have had a rough guess whether the person across was Turkish or Rum or English or French, but the two of them kind of enjoy this play. And the whole idea that İzmir is a city where you can bump into French women as easily as into a Turkish woman is something he apparently finds fascinating. And the other thing to note is that this correlation between different ethnicities and different suburbs, that the woman doesn't concern you whether I'm French or room, but that she answers whether I'm from Menemen or Cordelio, that these are sort of seen as perhaps indicators of where you are from. So this song, as I said, takes this ambiguity, makes it something which people enjoy. And I think this is remarkable to some degree, because quite often we've been told identities in 19th century Ottoman Empire, they're a zero-sum game. People believe they're either Greek or they're Turkish or this or that. But not all people were like that. And I found a few examples where people deliberately mixed the names of their children. So the daughter of the brewery founder, Clara, the brewery founder of the Prokop, Berta Prokop, Fanny Berta Prokop, she marries an Italian, but rather than sticking to Christian or Catholic names, they actually mix. They take Giovanni Camille, Nicolas Firuz, so on the one hand Italian, on the other hand Arabic. Two other examples in the middle, but the third example is also remarkable because usually people in this time considered, or people studying the 19th century, believed that fathers would always impose their religion on the rest of the family. Well, it's not always the case. For example, this guy, Mahmoud Kadri, he worked at Yildiz as an official, so even though he must have been of some mid-level status at least, when he married this German wife, Elisabeth, he was totally fine with having his son baptized as Richard Gustav Kadri in a Protestant parish in Salonika. So what I'm trying to drive at here, this common myth that people did not actively engage with the other, that is something we must get over. Of course, mixing of identities is not a completely new topic. It's actually been dealt with quite often, and one of the persons who's dealt with it was Sheriff Mardin in his work on super-Westernization in the Ottoman Empire. These people who over-identify with the other, who tried to pass as inconspicuously as possible among a Western or Westernized crowd. And he picked on especially the novel Araba Sevdası and its main character Bihruz Bey to illustrate this point. Bihruz Bey, who you can see on the illustration to a modern version of the book on the left-hand side, he tries to translate a Persian verse, tries to translate French verse, so something indicative of tradition, another thing of modernity, but he doesn't really manage either. He's somewhere stuck in between. That is something criticized in this period already in the 19th century, but actually seen more often in the later literature on this period. While Sheriff Mardin's work on this kind of super-Westernization or the Bihruz Bey syndrome is something remarkable and something very helpful for understanding the topics 19th century contemporaries discuss, I find it actually necessary to take this to a more European-wide level, to contextualize such characters not only within an Ottoman context, but to see this as a phenomenon which is actually happening all over the continent at this time period, especially also in the Habsburg Empire. So The Man Without Qualities, a novel dealing in retrospect with the Habsburg Empire, tries to portray such a character, Ulrich by name, who gets so much input from the modernity, the new possibilities of his age, which he's exposed to, that quite often this results actually in non-activity, that he's paralyzed, that he doesn't know what to do, which is why in a modern illustration of the novel he's actually portrayed as somebody in bed reading and having a big bubble about all his imaginations, which do not see fruition in the real world. Another author, a philosopher who dealt with this phenomenon is Friedrich Nietzsche. He also said that modern man is so overwhelmed by all these things that are being performed to him, using the masculine singular as Nietzsche did in the original, that he also fails to actually create, to be creative in any kind of way. Large revolutions, large wars pass him by. He doesn't know what to do with them. He doesn't know how to react to the cosmopolitan gods, morals, and arts carnival. So what is the reaction? How can people deal with this phenomenon as many people in the 19th century experience it? Nietzsche, on a little bit brighter side, said, well, let's go out there. Let's try to make the best of it. We don't believe that we are here in a period which is very stable, where we can believe in the certainties of our age in the 19th century. We think everything will pass by quickly. But we have a lot of light. We have a lot of possibilities. So let's make use of that. How does this relate to people in Salonika or Istanbul or İzmir in the 19th century? This is, one could think, far away from them. One thing which I found speaks very much to this feeling of being men or women without qualities is a debate I found by coincidence in the French language newspaper of Salonika in 1895. A large debate goes on. 1895 is a critical year in Ottoman history. A lot of you will know that. But what do they discuss? Women wanting to marry in Salonika. The publisher of the paper, Vitalis Cohen, writing under the pen name of Sheridan, writes, 11th plague which Moses forgot to smite Egypt with. They stalk our streets, their hair in the wind, their faces full of expressions from where you can read the violence of compromised ambitions and dreams which were not realized. So basically this piece makes fun of middle class and petit bourgeois women who desperately try to marry while a lot of the men refuse. He then suggests, well, what can we do with them? The Mormons in Salt Lake City, they can marry 50 wives, so let's send these Salonika women off to Salt Lake City. Very sexist, no question. Very obvious pun by an editor trying to push up the sales by provocation. But the interesting thing is less his satire, but the reactions. For weeks we have letters to the editor, both by women and by men. One of the first is a woman who openly states, well, why would I want to marry these meek men of Salonika? They don't have any ambitions. They are just, so their brains are all clouded by business. They can't deal with anything else. They don't develop their intellect by reading. They don't develop their body by sports. And then when we come to a dance, these men will be standing around chit-chatting about nothing but their business transactions. They won't be able to dance properly on the one hand because they don't exercise, on the other hand, because they never went to dancing lessons. So in the city without poetry or without ideals, basically she's demanding something better on the wedding bazaar. Then there's a retort by another man who complains, yes, she's completely right, we grow up in this town without any kind of ideals, and how can we exercise in a city where if you would only get on a bike, you would immediately sink into the mud and be covered in mud. And he throws in the phrase struggle for life in the English original, so this is a hint at the Darwinian dimension he sees in the important question whether you can ride a bike in Salonika in around 1900 or not. Yeah, why this bizarre debate, and what does it have to do with what I said before? The interesting thing, I think, is that this is exactly the phenomenon of men and women without qualities. These are people, they know full well the possibilities of the modern world. They all know very good French, in which they write their letters to the editor. They follow developments in that language. They know perfectly well that they should be more into music, know more about literature, do more sports, all these demands of the modern world, but somehow they feel not able, they feel paralyzed. They find that their surroundings somehow stop them from this, and these frustrations against the members of the other sex, which they could potentially marry, are also there because this could be the knight in shining armor who could ride up and deliver you from this fate of boredom in middle class, business-oriented Salonika around 1900. And this is just a larger piece of not only the gender identities, but also the class identities people negotiate in this period. There is a huge section of advice literature, but all this advice literature speaks to a very idealized form of family life. These families, they should be hygienic, be energetic. The woman should be able to play the piano, speak good French. The man should work the whole day in the office very hard, spend all his free time reading the newspapers. But that's not what life in the port cities actually were like. There were all these opportunities for nightlife. There was a lot of just seeing your friends. There was quite a brothel sector. There was smoking among both sides, among both women and men. There was alcohol among women and men, not equally spread, but it was there. And this kind of advice literature, it never catered to these realities. It was always at a very abstract level, and always quite often attuned to some kind of nationalist project. Which brings me to the last point I want to make here. In many ways, the port cities precipitated these, or let's put it this way, these very mixed port cities where gender identities were being renegotiated, where people either in some cases did not know exactly what ethnicity they were, or consciously decided to spur the old ideas about you have to be part of the Greek millet, or part of the Armenian millet, or part of the Catholics, or whoever. This order was in many ways starting to break down under these pressures created from inside the port cities. Realism, which went hand in hand with the European dream. It was something which was being challenged from the inside, from members, from these very elites, or and there I would take the example perhaps of Enver Pasha, somebody from upcountry Macedonia, but who was excellent in his education fields. He could have been part of this mixed society of Port City, but he chose not to, as did many others. This was a deliberate idea to do away with this old life, do away with this old world. Perhaps these people did not foresee that the consequences would be as destructive as they were, all these wars which we had as of 1911, the Italian-Ottoman War, the Balkan Wars, the First World War, the War of Independence. But when the situation came, partisans pushed forward and took into account that these port cities, as they had existed until this period in time, would be destroyed, and that practically not much of these old ambiguities, these old possibilities to live out different identities, that all this would be gone. In order not to try your patience too much, I'll leave it at that, and rather than wrapping up at a length, I'll just wish to hear your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malte. It's interesting talk. Before I take questions, you can already start thinking about the question you would like to ask. Just as my own impression that this whole idea of ambiguity is it's a bit interesting for us, because it's the way you described it, it's something to lose, and it's a danger to lose it in order to keep our way of living also today running. But on the other hand, you described it as something which threatened people in their existence or in their efforts, and it's a very ambiguity in itself, I would say. And as always, you think of the period of time you described and the period of time you're living in. That's basically something I think everybody was feeling. Is anybody, do you have questions? Please go ahead. I come with the mic, and as it's always difficult for the first one to start. Okay.
I don't.
Yeah.
I may not need this, but thank you very much for this very interesting, very intriguing lecture. I really appreciated the way you described the public space, how it was used, how modernity was lived out in this public space, cordon area. We live it in our daily life, so it's very interesting to see its spatial transformation. Now, it made me think that this was the way it was lived in the 19th century. It was more of a bottom-down kind of a happening than top-down. We always think of the transformation of cordon as a top-down process, but you brought or talked about how it was also how people internalize this public space as part of their daily life. So I think that's very, very interesting. And also beer gardens, right? That was another very interesting use of public space. I'm wondering about the gender question here. Of course, there's a class issue that you talked about, but how accessible were these public spaces, and especially beer gardens, to Muslim women? Maybe you can say something about that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I think yes, that's pretty much all I have. I've tried to study this picture in detail. I can't quite place the year, but this is definitely some time around 1918, so fairly late, in the last years of the Ottoman Empire, I would believe. I think before this, this is still something happening slowly. Mixed gender visits to the beer gardens, especially to the more upper class ones, yes, that is possible, but purely women or women and young children visiting, I think this is a late phenomenon. Sort of on the side of this debate about women in Salonika 1895, there's actually another letter to the editor which doesn't directly refer to this discussion. There is a woman who rides a bicycle through Salonika and then ends up at the White Tower tea garden or cafe. So this was possible, a woman on her own getting on a bicycle riding through town. But then she complains about vendors. There are non-stop vendors coming, trying to sell almonds, trying to sell imported stuff from China or so. And in the end, she runs off because she feels so molested in this cafe, which is a very upper class cafe. And there's statistics for İzmir for during the occupation, and at the time I think there's a number, don't know it off the top of my head, but it's like 450 cafes in town, most of them probably these small kind of corner street cafes, 13 of them upper class, 6 cater to women. So you see the dimension, and it's very much a class issue at the same time. This is something upper class women can possibly do, not something widespread at the time.